All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us here on this Tuesday evening for this discussion that we're going to have on race relations and, what we need to do as an African American community, how we need to partner with those from the Caucasian communities and just everyone jointly together to fight against this issue of race. So I'm glad to be here. I'm thrilled that I have some of the most intelligent people on the planet here with me here today that are going to join in on this discussion. And there are people that are passionate about this topic of race, where we as a church play in it, what we can do in our local area with government officials, et cetera, just to invoke change. So I'm going to allow these gentlemen to introduce themselves. So when I call you out, if you can please just tell us a little bit about yourselves, where you're from, a little bit about your ministry, if you are a pastor, and if not, some of the work that you do in your local area, positions that you serve in. So Mark Jerrell, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So first, let me say thank you so much for having me and allowing me to be in the midst of such a distinguished panel. This conversation is so important anytime we talk about faith and race. I think it definitely is appropriate and is certainly the order of the day. I'll say at the outset, I am not a minister, but I do have a ministry.
Amen.
That is one of education and social action as it relates to justice and social justice. And so I serve on the board of county commissioners here in Mecklenburg County. I am in the second year of my first term. This is my only and first role as an elected official, but have been active in the community and active in the struggle as it relates to get out the vote efforts, legislative efforts, and voter education. I am a proud husband and a father of two girls, and really are the catalysts that drive the work that I try to do. And what I'm trying to do is relative to leveling the playing field for our people and for those who are vulnerable and marginalized as well. And so it's an honor to serve, and it's an honor to be here among this group. So thank you.
Excellent. Excellent. Reverend Lyles.
Good evening. Thank you, Pastor Johnson, for inviting me to participate. I am honored, and I thank God for you and your work, and for all the panelists and the great work you gentlemen are doing. I serve as the pastor of New Life Ministries in Washington, D.C. I am a retired United Methodist pastor. I served in the UMC for 36 years in pastoral ministry. And for 11 years, I served as the director of multicultural student affairs at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And I am a life member of the Jefferson County branch of the NAACP, and serve on the Political Action Committee.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. Dr. Tim Laniak.
Thank you again, Pastor Barrington, for having us here. I came to Charlotte about 25 years ago from Boston, where I had been managing Section 8 housing during my doctoral program. Came here to run our urban ministry program, started up at Gordon Conwell Seminary. After that, I became dean of the Charlotte campus, and have also been involved in a lot of cross-cultural ministry, both here in the U.S. and also in other countries. And I'm quite interested in this topic, and I don't consider it a topic. I consider it lives. I almost feel like it's trivialized to call it a topic or an issue. But my wife and I had a great journey in Union County 20 years ago. We started Union Academy, a charter school that was really a great expression locally of a grassroots effort to bring equity out of the community and to celebrate it.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Derek Shakelford.
Good evening. Thank you, Pastor Johnson, for the invitation. I was a little awestruck when you said about this brilliant panel. I was wondering how I got invited to this conversation, but thank you, my friend. I appreciate it. I serve currently as pastor of Bucky's Town United Methodist Church in Frederick, Maryland. I've been pastoring there for 2 years. I've previously pastored in West Virginia and also started ministry here in Frederick, Maryland. And my whole, I guess, my life in terms of my background is athletics. But out of that, due to my upbringing, particularly civil rights has always been a DNA, I guess, in part of my DNA. And so part of this, our conversation and part of our advocacy work and part of our, I always say this for a Black preacher, that we are social justice preachers. And so I think that's very important and very relevant. And so looking at this in terms of all that we've gone through and all that we're experiencing now, in the words of scripture, there's nothing new under the sun. And so I'm just honored to be a part of this conversation. I also serve on the City of Frederick Board of Aldermen here in Frederick, Maryland, and did my dissertation work in faith and public policy, particularly urban ministry and public policy. So I'm excited about this conversation that we're about to embark on. Excellent.
All right. Well, thanks again, gentlemen, for joining me here today, partnering with me on this. And I think God's going to bless and we're going to have a really good conversation tonight. So just as we stated before, we're going to toss around some questions. Feel free to chime in, give your insight as you feel led to do so. Now, obviously, race is the topic. Racism, racial issues, disparities, and all that good stuff that we see in our current culture that has really been magnified right now with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Christian Cooper. These are situations that have made our national news within the last 30 to 45 days or so. And when we talk about racism, a lot of times we think of it as just an individual perspective. One person may view one individual differently than another due to their race. But it goes deeper than that. I'm sure you all will agree that we find it in institutions, and we see that there's a systematic approach to it. So actually, let me start with you, Mark, if you can just kind of give us some insight from your perspective. When we talk about institutionalized racism, what does that mean? And what are some examples maybe you can give? You're on mute too, by the way.
I apologize. I was trying to guard against my daughters busting in on me.
All right.
Yeah, but that's a great question. In the most simplistic way that I would break it down is essentially when you look at it's racism expressed through our social or political structures. And you could look at the outcomes that create those institutional structures that create those disparate outcomes as it relates to health, as it relates to education, as it relates to housing, as it relates to all of those quality of life indicators that African Americans in particular find ourselves on the wrong end of. And so it goes beyond those items that I named, but it really permeates into every aspect of society. And so, for example, if in hiring practices, we talk about diversity, but you have people that typically hire folks that look like themselves, right? So, the brilliant individuals that you have on this panel don't get that same shot when they're more than qualified. So that's why you have a hierarchy in a lot of corporations that look exactly the same, and they don't have diversity, and they have no people of color there. And so it's really played out in those institutions and societal structures that I named.
Good. Now, so a question that I have in general, and anyone can address this. So now, coming against the racism that has been identified, government, education, in various fields, various different sectors. It's institutionalized. So the fight against it, should this be something that the Black community leads by themselves exclusively, or should this be something that we should unite with other cultures, particularly the white community, to bring to a resolution? And Reverend Lyles, I'd like for you to answer that one if you can, please.
Okay. Well, let me say, first of all, that the fight against racism is not something I sought. I was dragged into it. My ministry was in Washington, D.C., which at that time was predominantly Black. I believe, the population was something like 8 to 90% Black. And, our focus as pastors was primarily on poverty, and we wanted to win souls for Christ and so forth, and, fill up the church pews and build churches full of people. And then I was appointed to 2 churches in Jefferson County, West Virginia. There, the African American population was 7%. And so I was pastoring Mount Zion United Methodist in Charlestown, and I would come, to a church meeting to do what pastors normally do, and that is to discuss evangelism and the church budget, and property renovation, all those things that are important to pastors. And one of my members, every meeting, he would challenge me on addressing racism. That was Mr. George Rutherford. And, I am trying to, get the church budget done and these projects done, and he keeps talking about racism. And I'm like, okay, man, we will, get to that. But right now I have some pastoral duties. Anyway, to make a long story short, he was, in my opinion, at that time, agitating, and he really annoyed me as a pastor. But the more I was in the area, the more I could see how prevalent racism was. And he was not trying, I learned later, he was not trying to agitate me. He was trying to educate me and let me know that there were people, African Americans in our county, who were hurting, who were suffering, and that pastors spend too much time in the pulpit talking about Christ and not enough time in the community serving the people as Christ did. So, it was the nudging, if you will, of Mr. Rutherford that got me involved. Okay. So, once we got in, once I got involved, I began to address issues there in the area. And then in 1992, following the brutal beating of Rodney King, it was that it was at that point where I became extremely convicted about serving and meeting the needs. Addressing the issue of racism. And right before that, about 4 years earlier, Black students at Shepherd College, it was then Shepherd College, it is now Shepherd University, they would visit the church athletes, and they would share their story. They would share their pain and their struggle dealing with racism. And we were involved in a major building project at the time. And so I said to the students that, once, I get through this project, I would, spend more time with them, helping them. And so the cry from the students at Shepherd and the nudging of Mr. Rutherford led me as a pastor to come out of the pulpit and go into the streets to address a sin of racism. I hope I answered your question.
I think you were definitely heading that direction. I guess the only other thing to add to that is, do you think that in addressing it, should it only be a conversation that the African American community or church has, or should it be in partnership with the white community as well?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So in 1992, after the beating of Rodney King, my white colleague Randy Trimble, who was pastor of the Shepherdstown Presbyterian Church, he contacted me and said, Ernest, what can we do, as members of the body of Christ to address racism? And so his predominantly white church and my predominantly black church came together. And we put forth and we developed a plan to address racism. Excuse me. And the plan included organizing, educating, and advocating. And so, we pull out of people together. And the first thing we had to do, Dr. Johnson, is to educate our own people, because black folk and white folk, many of them really do not understand what racism is. They will look at the extreme acts of racism, such as the murder of a Mr. Floyd, but they overlook the institutional racism that exists in our schools, in many in our judicial system, and so, for the example, right before you attended Shepherd, the population, the minority student population was between 2% and 3% for about 15-20 years, and there was no effort to increase the number of minority students. And it wasn't until we got organized and intentional about making a difference, we were able to make a difference. So yes, cooperating and collaborating with churches of different races is critical in our battle with the sin of racism. And we must come out of our pulpits as pastors and become street pastors, just like Jesus was.
Yeah.
I was telling folk that Jesus did not spend time in the temple, and when he did go, they kicked him out, So maybe some of our some of the church members need to kick the pastors out of the pulpit and send them to the streets.
Send them to the streets. Well, I'm gonna tell you, I like what you said, identifying racism as a sin, and I think that when we put it in that category, then that mandates the church to address it. So it's more than just a social thing or social issue, but now it's a kingdom thing, because it's something that if it's against the will of God, collectively as a church, we have to rally behind it to come against it. So Dr. Laniak, how would you suggest, or what are some ways that you could say that the white community could partner with the Black community or Black churches in this fight against racism?
Well, ideally, the Black church is an incredible resource for cultural competence and awareness and personal experience. But there is a history of the Caucasian community not always responding well to Black leadership, not following well. A lot of churches that are multicultural are often led by white pastors, and you probably know it's hard to attract Caucasians to a church that's predominantly Black. So there's a lot going on culturally that affects people's attitudes and their mentality about following. But I really think that it's this counterintuitive kingdom value that says we're not going to understand it well if we just, as a majority community, if we just try to figure it out ourselves, try to sift through the news, the social media, the incidents and the accidents, and to say, okay, we really know what we need to do for them. It's a much more collaborative and humble approach to say, what can we do to follow you? But I just want to hasten to say, I posted something on Facebook, but there was something else it was about the day after the George Floyd incident with Cooper, and there was something else I wrote, but I didn't send it broadly out to Facebook. I only sent it to some friends, because part of what I was asking them for was, how do I move beyond being safe to being an asset, to being an advocate, to being an ally? And I chose people that could understand that I wasn't adding to their burden to say, lead me. But I didn't post it because I understand that a lot of people in the Black community feel like, if you're white and you're still asking, what do I need to do? Then I'm tired of this. I don't need that assignment. I feel scandalized when I have white friends who want a project by, asking somebody to be their one Black friend. I just think, if you're tired of that and you don't have the patience and the sense of calling to do that, you can just say no. We have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of responsibility on our shoulders. But at the end of the day, we don't do well unless we listen and follow.
Excellent, good response. While we're here, and I'm gonna throw something at you, Dr. Shakelford, here in a minute. But Dr. Laniak, let me ask you this question: do you think that the white community, if they were serious about fighting racism and cultural differences, do you think that many white churches or pastors would be willing to let go of the images and the rhetoric that kind of portrays Christianity as a white person's religion, if they knew that it would help resolve the issues of race?
I know what you're getting at, and you can just, there's a YMCA I go to that has a very diverse membership, but they have a picture of white Jesus for some reason on the wall, and I think why is it that it doesn't dawn on anybody that that's really inaccurate? The only thing I'd say is it can be cosmetic. When people actually go through diversity training, when they get sort of re-educated about racism, sometimes some lights go off, and they might say, "Oh yeah, let's celebrate Black History Month with some kind of a sermon or a special focus Sunday, or let's take down the picture, or let's do a pulpit trade, with a Black church in town." It feels very cosmetic, and it doesn't feel very integrated and holistic. It doesn't feel organic and permanent. And I think that's partly because racism is not typically a one-off problem. it comes out of a lack of self-awareness, a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding history and context. So my sense is that you might be able to fix a little bit of the behavior without ever getting at the cognitive kind of presets that people have.
Yeah.
My sense is that if people intuitively know how to relate to people that are different than them, then racism is only one problem that we start to get rid of. Because the fact is, there are people who are non-Black in this country that are marginalized. Women in general throughout history have been marginalized. There is a kind of blindness that goes with power and privilege. And I know these are loaded words and some people just immediately think it's political rhetoric, but it just blinds us. So if you actually learn empathetic skills, if you learn to be self-aware, you may very well become aware of even more than your racism. And I think that actually would contribute better than to just try to get people to pass a course in racial, I have a friend who works at one of the big establishments in Charlotte, one of the big banks, and he said, every time we have professional enrichment, it's always called diversity training. I don't know that the culture's changing because of all the sessions on diversity training.
Wow.
And I see churches that don't even have those courses. So, I mean, the education hasn't even begun.
Yeah. Wow. Well said. Well, let me get you in here, Dr. Shakelford. So, from a biblical perspective, how does the Bible address social injustice, and what direction can we get from scriptures maybe that can help us resolve this?
Thank you, Pastor Johnson. Thank you for that question. I think a couple of things is, one is, we look at this notion of, or this concept of justice, is there is the justice that we have and there's the justice that God has. One example would be in Jeremiah chapter 12. Jeremiah has a problem with the justice that's happening, and he just doesn't understand why it appears that wicked people are getting ahead. God has called him to be the prophet, to preach with this notion, Jeremiah, you're going to preach to people, but you're going to fail. And so Jeremiah is a problem because Jeremiah is being called by God to speak to people, to preach to people who don't want to hear it. There's injustice in the land, and it feels like it appears that those folks who are perpetuating the injustice are getting ahead. In chapter 12, it shifts because then Jeremiah asked God the question that about your justice. And then God lays out these parameters for his answering to Jeremiah these questions about justice. And verse 5 is very poignant because he says to Jeremiah, if you can't run with the footmen, then you can't contend with the horses. In other words, what you're experiencing now is small in comparison to what's going to happen in the future. Go fast forward to the New Testament, and we look at this. I want to take this angle, looking at this this notion of protest. Jesus' whole life was protest. He was always countercultural to what was happening in the culture at the time. He was ushering in a new kingdom. And so that was a threat to what was happening to those particular persons or entity, or the kingdom, small k, of oppression, of dominance, of all those things that were not allowing people to live in liberation and freedom. And so we look at it in terms of the context of scripture. Jesus' whole life was one of justice, countercultural to what was happening at the time. A perfect example would also be Palm Sunday. On one end, Jesus riding in on the donkey. On the other end, if you look at biblical theology, is Pilate's coming in on the other end as king, but he's coming as king of, quote unquote, of an area or his part, and he's intimidated, and he has to let people know of his dominance. He's coming in on a white horse, coming in with military, coming in to let the people know of his dominance. Jesus is coming in on a donkey, lowly, coming in, though he's king, and he knows who he is. And he's letting people, and people thought that Jesus was coming to liberate them from Roman domination and Roman oppression. Jesus was coming to do both, salvation and for you to live holistically with your neighbor and community. And one would even take from a biblical theology of, I would look at this in this, to Dr. Laniak's kind of viewpoint, or his segue would be looking at this from a theological vantage point of God and love. Our whole premise of fighting racism, if you will, is because of our love for humanity. And so once you look at that lens, because racism is not just, we talk about the systemic, we talk about the institutionalized, but racism is also a moral argument. And looking at that through the moral lens is, I love for humanity is, I want humanity to live freely, to live holistically, to live in community. And the reason why I don't like racism, or I'm trying to dismantle it, is to whatever that is, and like Dr. Laniak had mentioned, whatever that is, the whole premise and my whole theological viewpoint and my whole standard is God, love. And that's why I want people to live freely. If I can also address the first question, because I think this is important, we talk about racism. One of the things I think is kind of, particularly during these times, is America in particular being great, quotation marks. And one of the reasons why we're great is because of racism and violence. That's how America's got to where it is now. And one of the problems I think we're having is to acknowledge that. We oftentimes hear that was 400 years ago, that was 200 years ago. I didn't own slaves, but that's how we got here. And America does not want to confront, acknowledge, or even admit that that's part of the reason, a large part of the reason, while America, quote unquote, is great. Because if America admits that, it has to admit that it has sins of violence and racism of making it who it is. And so I just think that's very important for us in this context, but also looking at this from a biblical standpoint of theology is God, love, and that's why we're fighting racism and everything that Dr. Laniak mentioned, that racism is just one of those sins in which we're called to confront or eradicate.
Yeah, well said. So going back to you, Mark, Black Lives Matter. This has been a movement that has caused a lot of ruckus in our society, or I would say a disruption, primarily because whenever that is spoken, whenever that is pushed, the response is all lives matter. And so there's this back and forth, Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. There's something missed in what's being communicated. So what would you say to anyone if you were trying to explain to them what really Black Lives Matter means? And how would you address some of the notion that it's a statement that says Black lives only matter? What would be your thoughts?
Yeah, well, first off, I don't even try to explain it, because if I have to try to explain it to someone, it's already a no-win situation. It's not someone that's going to be ready to hear or understand, because that is, if you understand the history of Black people in this country, and if you are looking at the things that Black people have gone through and been going through for the last 400 years or 401 years since we stepped foot on this soil officially, you would understand why people are saying Black Lives Matter. When you can watch a videotape of policemen in Reverend Lyles referenced this in 1992. You can see a video of policemen beating a Black man half to death in Brother Rodney King, and they get off when they're taken to court. When you could see a young man like Trayvon Martin gunned down by some vigilante in the neighborhood and he gets off. When you look at, Eric Garner, who is selling Lucy cigarettes and he gets choked to death. So we have all these situations where these are non-threatening situations that escalate into a level of violence. I watched Philando Castile get shot multiple times in a car with a 3-year-old Black girl in the back seat of the car. Like that, these are horrific situations that Black men find ourselves in all the time. And so when we say Black Lives Matter, I'm not here to justify that we should, why we say that, or all lives matter and so on and so forth. I think there has been certainly a disconnection and a unwillingness to really validate and to really admit the atrocities that Black people have faced. And so we have to stand
I think he froze for a second. Can the rest of y'all still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. We'll give him a few seconds, see if his connection clears. If not, Reverend Lyles, I have a question I want to throw towards you. So we'll see.
Okay. And while we're waiting, can I just say something about the question
sure
that you just asked?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was reading a post earlier on Facebook with a group that was discussing this very subject. And what I left that conversation with is this. Black Lives Matter is a slogan,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, it is like an incomplete sentence,
Mm-hmm.
and it allows people to use their own interpretation to complete that sentence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so there are some people who will complete it this way. They will say Black Lives Matter, and other lives don't matter. You see what I'm saying? That's the way they complete it. But what the message we are to get from that, and this is the way we would complete the sentence, and that is Black Lives Matter just as much as white lives.
Mm-hmm.
You see, and so we are not trying to exclude anybody, but we, but the message is Black Lives Matter just as much as white lives.
Mm-hmm.
So white police are not murdering white citizens, because they have already concluded that white lives matter.
Mm-hmm.
But yet they are murdering black, men and women, because in their racist minds, black lives don't matter.
And Pastor Johnson, if I could add this, and it's not just also from the standpoint of death.
Mm-hmm.
We can look at this COVID-19 crisis now and look at disproportionately black people dying. So it's not only just in terms of a policing issue, a law enforcement issue, it's also a health crisis issue, an economic issue, and some of the things we talk about from the institutional and systemic standpoints are happening. So it's not so much just in terms of life, well, it's life and death, but life and death from the law enforcement context. I think it's kind of evolved out of that. But looking at COVID-19, how disproportionately affected African Americans, and disproportionately in terms of, and I think it speaks to what we talked about from health to economics to housing to education, and that's why it's Black Lives Matter, because it's not just in terms, and all these things are affecting life and death. And so I think it's important for us to know, because already ingrained within our society, in which the context in which we live is that it's unspoken. We already know that this is the way it is, and you better get with the programs, to so to speak. And what's happening now is Black Lives Matter simply means this: hey, we're trying to say in these particular areas of context, we're dying. And we're dying before our time, we're dying disproportionately, and we're slowly dying. And what we're saying is Black lives do matter just as much as you put the emphasis, or you put the dollars, and you put the resources in the various communities. Black lives matter. And that's the whole context of saying Black Lives Matter.
And I agree with Pastor Dirk 100%. Do you know, in 2020, black kids in Jefferson County, West Virginia, can spend their entire 12 years in public school and never be taught by an African American teacher, because of the lack of teachers. So the black kids' lives matter. right? You know, they deserve to have African American teachers just as much as the white kids have white teachers.
Yeah.
Just yesterday, I was in a meeting with our NAACP president, and we were talking about a plan that we fought for in 1999
Mm-hmm.
that the Jefferson County school system promised to implement in 2000.
Mm-hmm.
And the plan included what we call a grow your own teacher program, where young black kids would be mentored, you know, to become teachers in the Jefferson County school system. And there would be scholarships and so forth to help them. 20 years ago, our kids were going through the system without a black teacher.
Mm.
We came up with a plan. We called it the diversity plan. 20 years after that, in 2020, our kids can still go through the system without a black teacher.
Mm.
Dr. Shack had it absolutely right. It's systemic, it's institutionalized, and our black kids' lives matter. And we, you know, it is just across the board.
Mm. Mark, I'm gonna come back to you because I know I'm assuming you probably had a little bit more to say before you drop for a second. But before I come to you, Dr. Laniak, I did have one question I wanted to ask you, because when I think about racism in general, or at least the way that I've approached it whenever I've taught on the subject to you know, my church or just in random conversation with individuals. I always bring it back to me what makes sense, the Imago Dei, or the image of God. And for some reason, you know, when I hear Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, you know, and the back and forth, what I'm seeing is that there's not an understanding that what we're really trying to say is that as an African American race, we bear the same image of God.
Yeah.
Just as any other race. So just speaking of the Imago Dei, the image of God, how would you address that, even from a seminary perspective on teaching how that contributes to racism?
Well, that's just what I was thinking when Dr. Shakelford was talking about a biblical theological angle on this. And, you know, just allow me a little bit of a journey into some ancient Near Eastern institutions. You know, in ancient law codes, like the famous Hammurabi's Law Code, there are a lot of common sentiments and sensibilities and statements that you'll find in the Bible. Mm-hmm. But one thing that the Hammurabi's Code did was it actually reinforced class. And one of the ways to watch it play out was that if you killed another person and you were a full citizen, you could buy your way out of the penalty. You could, if you killed a slave. But if a slave killed somebody else, then the slave was always killed. And part of what the Bible rectified in a way that seems much more dramatic than we notice, because there are a lot of laws in the Bible that were shared across the ancient world. But one thing the Bible said was, every single person is made in God's image. And if you take another person's blood, your blood will be required of you. And it actually goes back to Adam and Eve and their two sons, Cain and Abel, and what, you know, the blood that was crying out from the ground. And it's a fundamentally Christian, fundamentally biblical notion. And I think that again, one reason why racism is only one of the issues that actually starts to change when people have a biblical worldview is that it's not only that Black Lives Matter, but when you look around and you realize if anybody is not experiencing the kind of freedom that is basic to being human, if somebody's a slave, if somebody's oppressed, if somebody's suffering as a child laborer, that your heart goes out to them automatically as somebody who has the image of God. And part of what Dr. Shakelford was saying was love God and love your fellow man. And part of what brings the two commandments in the Bible together is that when you love your fellow man, you are loving the God whose image they are. Yeah. And so it's, in some ways, it's the only true test of our love for God is how we treat other people. And you can't segregate them and say, well, I do a pretty good job of treating some people well, because that means you don't actually recognize that all people are in God's image.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's the perfect kind of lens to be wearing. And, you know, in some ways, people are even throwing this in the face of the Black Lives Matter movement to say, well, if you don't care about black on black murder, then why should you have a right to say that, you know, white on black murder is worse, or police? I mean, there are all kinds of things that get wrapped into that kind of discussion. Obviously, police, the authority, the power, the unique role of police in a society and all that. But it at least raises the question that all of us should ask of ourselves is, are we ever just limiting this to Black Lives Matter? And are we even just limiting it to Black Lives Matter as much as white people? Because all over the world, where, you know, there are people that are now saying Palestinian lives matter. And in a way, their context is saying as much as Israeli Jews' lives matter. So you want to be, I mean, the Bible actually helps us from reductionism, so that this is only a social or political issue. It makes it a lifelong journey into recognize the image of God in other people. And that's children, that's people that are disabled, that's people that are jobless and homeless. You know, yeah. It's a battle we're all going to fight, because our tendency isn't necessarily to look out for every single person the way Mother Teresa envisioned them, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well said. So now going back to you, Mark, I have another question I wanted to ask you, but in case you had anything else you wanted to add to this Black Lives Matter piece, go ahead and do so, and I'll ask you another question.
Yeah, just real quick, and you know, thank you for allowing me to address it, Pastor. You know, the bottom line with BLM, and from my perspective, is this: is that, you know, the movement just says we matter. The reason why I don't get into that discussion about all lives matter, because particularly when we're talking about white people, there's justice for white people. Mm-hmm. They can go to court, they can get justice, right? But what I was leaning towards when I was giving those examples about Rodney King and Trayvon and Eric Garner and Philando Castile and the other brothers and sisters that have been, we've watched them in horrific situations, and we found every single time that there is no justice. And so we've also found every single time that there's no justice for folks that have been our family members for decades and hundreds of years. We won't even talk about reparations for Black people. So when we talk about all lives matter, no, you know, the mantra is we matter. And if you don't acknowledge we matter, I'm going to acknowledge it. I have 2 little girls, and it's important for me to know that they matter, no matter what anybody says or no matter what this society says. So that's, you know, well, I'll put a button on that, Pastor. But and the other thing is, you know, if we're being honest here, and I'm the only one that's not a minister on this panel or pastor, but I will say this: when I'm talking to people on the street, it's very difficult for the faith community to come from a high ground when you see what the evangelical community and other faith communities are advocating, perpetuating, and reinforcing and signing off on. Yeah. So I know that's not going to be popular on this call, but I'm just saying that is something that I see when I'm on the street and I'm talking to our brothers and sisters as well. So I'll put a button and stop right there.
Well said. And I actually, we probably should have started with the Black Lives Matter, because I don't even think we scratched the surface on everything that could be said there. But listen, gentlemen, let's do this. So we have about 5 minutes left, maybe a little bit longer. We'll wrap up right at around 8 or a few minutes after. I do have a question in general for each of you. So if you can take 1 minute, I know it's going to be hard, but take 1 minute just to give a response to the question that I ask, and then we'll move on to the next one. We'll get ready to wrap up for the night. So at any rate, Mark, I'll start with you while you're right there. What can I do as an individual to challenge my local government to invoke change?
Well, you got to, number one, you got to let your voice be heard. You have to be informed. You have to educate yourself. You have the low hanging fruit is vote, right? That's number one. But you can go to your city council meeting, your school board meeting, your county commission meeting. You can advocate on behalf of your community. You can galvanize people around issues that you care about. You can advocate for specific policies, and I know we didn't have time to get there, but there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. You can, email addresses in our community are public information. You can email, you can demand certain things be done. But I would say, one, let's educate ourselves about what's going on in our community. Let's galvanize, let's vote, and let's make sure that we're trying to be the change that we want to see.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. So, Dr. Shakelford, why would you say racism tends to be more of an issue of politics instead of humanity?
Because politics is about power. And so I think we kind of had this conversation in terms of the history of, particularly of America, is America's always been about power and dominance. And so it's the opportunity to exude that power and dominance. And so that's no different in politics, because politics is about who gets what, when, and where. And so in that notion of politics being who gets what, when, and where, if I have the power, then I have the opportunity to decide who gets what, when, and where. And if this system is in place that I maintain power, I'm going to protect that. And by any means necessary, and I don't mean to take the Malcolm X quote out of context, but basically, if we look in terms of our political climate, we see power being exuded that we'll sacrifice. I want to touch about Tim's point real quick about evangelicals, because I think it's important, because that's what they believe. It's not even that they're co-opting a message in terms of politics. That's what they believe in terms of their theology about God. But I digress. And so looking at that's why you see this notion of what we're happening now is an exchange system. We'll let a president behave any kind of way, moral failings, everything else, no matter truth telling, we'll sacrifice that at the altar of power, because we're exchanging something. As long as we can maintain power, get what we want, place judges, tax breaks, tax cuts, whatever we need to stay in power, that's what we'll do, no matter what. And we've seen that play out more than ever now in our political context. So in terms of the context of racism, it's simply about power. Yeah. If I can maintain power, hold on to power, if that means at your expense, if that means that I got to keep the same systems and institutions in place to maintain that, that's what I'll do. And we see that being played out more than ever right now.
Excellent. Well said. Reverend Lyles, what are some areas we as Black people can improve ourselves to change the perception about our culture, or even the narrative about our culture that's out there?
Well, I think we need to address the issue of internalized self-hatred. And perhaps that will be a topic that we will discuss, on another setting. But Commissioner Mark says something. He talked about the evangelical church, and I have been so frustrated over the hypocrisy in the church.
Yeah.
And I know we don't have time to talk about it now, but I really think that this is an important subject. When we talk about the Church of Jesus Christ, there is hypocrisy in the church, and I don't understand how a group that we consider, when I was in seminary, we considered them the moral compass of our nation. And now they can support a leader. 80% of them can support a leader who lives any kind of way and who has stirred the pot of hatred. And they justify it.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I don't know, I know I didn't go too far into the question that you asked.
That's all right.
But Mark hit on that. And that and you just got me stirred up. So that's something that we really have to talk about, the hypocrisy in the church. And as it relates to the question that you asked me, too many Black churches are silent on the issue of racism. Black pastors, everybody's trying to build the biggest building. Everybody's trying to fill up the pews. I'm talking about Black pastors now.
Yeah.
And everybody's putting thousands and thousands and millions of dollars into buildings while the people outside of those buildings are hurting.
Yeah.
So yes, we can do something for ourselves by coming out of the church building and meeting the needs of the people. That's what Jesus did.
Yeah.
And we should do the same thing.
Yeah.
I think
Excellent.
that's too much time.
No, that's okay. Hey, that was worth the while. So I'll say that. But Dr. Laney, I'll give you the last question and we'll wrap up here. But just in general, in case we haven't mentioned, or in case there's more that you can say on the topic of what the church can do, if you were to add anything to that, what could we do as the church at large, the body of Christ, to take a stance against racism?
I might frame it in terms of the roles of churches and the roles of its leaders as being prophetic, priestly, and royal. So I guess Dr. Shakelford and I both sort of tend towards the biblical theological lens, and that doesn't mean there's no place for activism. I'm just trying to get inside the conceptual grid to make sense of it. The prophetic role of the church, it shouldn't be relegated to one part of the church. That prophetic role does speak truth to power. It is unsettling. It is exposing. It's the John the Baptist who said things that got him put in jail and then eventually lost his head. The church is also priestly, and that's a mercy-showing church that lives in a broken world and doesn't just criticize the institutions and individuals in power, but it also serves the people that are impacted by it. But the third one is royal, and I would say the church builds alternative systems. So you can critique as a prophet the kind of systemic racism, but you also offer an alternative system that's egalitarian, that has equity, that actually doesn't look for everyone to be equal, but it actually prefers people who are marginalized, people that are powerless and hopeless, etc. But it also finds ways, and I trust Mark will appreciate this, it finds ways to take that vision of an ideal kind of world with those values, and it tries to lay the seeds for those and cultivate those seeds in society. So it's not an insulated project like it's a greenhouse, but the greenhouse is where you grow things that you try to put outside where the elements are not always conducive for growth. And you try to nurture them because you believe in the image of God. You believe that society can actually do better than it does with people that are not being treated fairly and all. So I'd say that would be the message for any. I'll just make a footnote that my sense is that my own experience in the Black church has been generally that it's much more holistic, much more integrated. It's personal and social. It has a reflective side, but it also has an activist side. And there are what I would call suburban sensibilities that have kind of infected a lot of the white evangelical churches and probably a lot of suburban churches in general to privatize faith and to view a lot of issues we're talking about as though they're strictly social and political without being in the game. And I had a good friend that was an AME Zion pastor in Charlotte years ago who said to me, we were meeting with all of our administrators in the denomination, because Charlotte's a place with a lot of leadership in the AME Zion. And he said, there was a vote on the city council, and he said, people stormed the doors of our meeting and they said, you can't keep meeting. We have an issue that you have to deal with. And he said to me, we don't have the luxury of saying it's our, well, this goes back to what Pastor Lyles was saying. You don't have the luxury of saying, I'm in charge of Church Incorporated. That's my job. That's my business. That's my world. The world is inside the Black church in a much more prevalent and consistent and comprehensive way. And it's a lot more common to have the kind of to have the agenda sometimes set for you rather than to set your own.
Well said. Well, listen, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough. I enjoy hanging out with you all for the night. So I appreciate you all sacrificing your time to be not just with me here, but I'm getting messages throughout my phone and on our church site just saying that a lot of people are commenting, agreeing, they've learned a lot. So I appreciate you all taking this night to help us with this. And leave your schedules open because I may want to do this again with the same cast of characters. So I don't even think we scratched the surface. But listen, many thanks to you all, to everybody who's viewing here, or if you're watching on a playback, or if you just want to give the information to somebody. We will put this on YouTube, and the link will be shared on our church YouTube channel within the next few days. So at any rate, God bless everyone. Let me just pray over us real quick, and then we'll get ready to dismiss. So Father God, we thank you, dear Lord, that you are still on the throne. And even though, dear God, sometimes things, even right now, seem dark and chaotic and out of control, let us always be reminded that you're still in control,
Yes.
even though things seem out of control. But Father, we just pray that we'll trust you. As you lead, you be the good shepherd, we'll be your sheep, and we will follow. Challenge all of us in our individual areas, dear Lord, to use our platforms to come against any act of racism, which we know is a sin from the pit of hell. So, Father, dear Lord, I pray that not just us, but everybody who is listening right now and viewing, that they will use their voice, their platforms, whether it's in the gym, at work, church, office, anywhere that they see it, that they'll speak against it. Because we know ultimately this is a kingdom thing, dear God.
Yes.
And we're all citizens of your kingdom. We're trying to expand it at a greater rate, dear Lord. So we love and we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
God bless you all.
Thank you,
To you
sir.
all here,
Thank
thank
you,
you
sir.
for
Thank you.
joining in.
Thank you.
We appreciate you. God bless.